I was introduced to Gregg Levoy with his book, The Calling. And then a few years ago at one of our Unity conventions in Kansas City, he was one of the keynote speakers, and he spoke and then provided a workshop, and I was really captivated by what he had to say, and I was truly blessed. So I was incredibly thrilled when I found out he now resides, he's been here for a number of years, he now makes Asheville his home. Gregg is an accomplished writer. He was a former columnist and reporter for USA Today. He's written for a number of different companies, including the New York Times Magazine. He has spoken on most of the ABC, NBC, CBS. He was a behavioral specialist for USA Today. So I asked him, did he know how to behave? And he said, I'm learning that one. So he has a new book out, Vital Signs, The Nature and Nurture of Passion. And you know, we're in a 7-week spring series based on tying together our chakras in the book of Revelation of how we are all beings of light. And one of the things we've talked about is passion. Today he's going to bring an incredible message for us. Would you please welcome Gregg Levoy.
All right. Well, good morning. Good morning. It's wonderful to be back. It's been about 10 years. And by the way, condolences on the loss of your marvelous Minister Chad. He was a gem and a character, and I gather a pretty good golf player. So there's that. All right. So I received recently a letter from my older brother, Mark, and he was announcing that he had decided to retire from Stanford University and go to work for Google, where he had spent the last year or so on a paid leave of absence working on the Google Glass project, which I gather has just had its plug officially pulled. He said it was the single most difficult decision of his life and one that is irrevocable. In other words, he can never go back to being a professor at Stanford. But he said that in the final analysis, he faced two inarguable truths. One is that he was having more fun at Google, and the other is that he was enjoying fresh challenge. And I'm impressed that his decision to leave the university was based in large measure on the desire to have fun, which as the basis of a momentous and irreversible career decision would almost seem to be a little frivolous. Yet it's anything but. It's anything but. His decision to leave a job that doesn't get much more prestigious or secure than a tenured professorship at Stanford in order to have fun strikes me as a profound validation of the importance of that precious commodity. All right? And so in his email to everybody announcing this decision, he said that one of the pivotal factors in his decision to leave the university was, of all things, a little newspaper clipping that I had sent him way back when he started at the university, and which he said he had kept pinned to the center of his bulletin board ever since. And it said, "How fossils are formed." Step 1, get tenure. Step 2, teach for 20 years. All right? And he said, by the time I leave Stanford in a couple of years, it will have been exactly tenure plus 20 years. And then he said, thank you for sending me that clipping. So you never know, you know. So the philosopher Nietzsche was fond of encouraging people to live dangerously. All right? He used to say, build your cities on the slopes of Vesuvius. Send your ships into uncharted seas. All right? This is a sentiment that looks great on a poster. Okay? But I think it's another matter entirely when we're talking about the lives of actual people, ordinary people, especially when what may be at stake is, let's say, a regular paycheck, or a pension, or medical benefits. I mean, never mind that the only reason you're actually using those medical benefits is your job is making you sick, you know. when what may be at stake is just domestic tranquility, or even just your physical safety. But I think that this much is certain, that our desire to have passion and vitality and a sense of aliveness in our lives is joined at the hip with the desire for safety and security and a sense of control over our lives. And I think one of the high arts of living dangerously is continually refereeing the contest, the tug of war between passion and security. Okay? And giving ourselves both because we need both, right? I heard somebody say once that heroism, or heroinism, of course, can be redefined for the modern age as the ability to tolerate paradox. Heroism, the ability to hold two contrary impulses, ideas, beliefs, energies inside you at the same time and still retain the ability to function, if not hang on to your cookies. And not everybody apparently manages to hang on to their cookies. I read a story recently in one of my favorite sources of news of the weird. Have you seen this in the Express? This is actually real news. These are real news outtakes. But I saw an article about a police being summoned to an apartment complex in Mesa, Arizona, after neighbors reported a fight between a man and a woman that included screaming and breaking things. But when the policemen got there, all they found was a 21-year-old man simulating a fight between a man and a woman by alternating a low-pitched voice with a high-pitched voice. I would say that constitutes news of the weird. And I love that the article rather dryly noted that he was referred for a medical exam. Apparently, the inability to hold paradox was the least of his problems. And, I made, some years ago, I made a very revealing Freudian slip that I think highlights some of the challenges of balancing passion and security. I had gone on the road to do some adventure travel, to in fact send my ships into uncharted seas, at a time when I had a lot of irons in the fire, a lot of business projects that I was juggling and that my income depended on. And I was apparently more stressed out about this than I was aware, because what I meant to say on the outgoing message of my answering machine was, "Hello, this is Gregg Levoy. I'll be out of the office until August 25th. But what I said instead, and didn't find out until I got home, was, "Hello, this is Gregg Levoy. I'll be out of control until August 25th. Which certainly explains some of the messages that were waiting for me when I got home. Wow. But my general observation is that in the contest between passion and security, security has a tendency to win. Passion tends to get backburnered. All right? But I think that if we're not expressing it, then we're suppressing it, or repressing it, or depressing it. They all mean the same thing, pushing it down. All right? Pushing it down. And but the thing is that the clinging to safety and security is not just a personal problem. Okay? It is, among other things, it's multi-generational. All right? And it's certainly cultural. I mean, we live, I think, in a culture that likes its gates and its guardrails, likes its bailouts and its subsidies, where schools routinely close down playgrounds for insurance purposes. And manufacturers feel compelled to put warning labels on their products that say things like, "Caution, hot coffee is hot." You remember the McDonald's case? Or "Do not iron clothes on body." These are real, I've seen these. "This Superman costume does not enable you to fly." Wow. And here's my favorite of the bunch. Remove children from stroller before folding up for storage. What? I mean, do we really need to be told that? Wow. I just think that continually opting for safety and security over passion and vitality, and in any arena, whether it's your vocational life, your creative life, expressive life, love life, spiritual life, I think that continually opting for security and comfort will not, in my opinion, or my experience, ever adequately compensate you for giving up your passions and selling your soul. They will probably allow you to suffer in nicer surroundings, okay? But I don't think that they'll ever really adequately compensate us because the fact is we don't just crave safety and security. Even in a code orange world, we also crave their opposite, all right? We crave excitement and novelty and discovery, and we crave spontaneity and an adrenaline rush from time to time. For some people, a locker at the bus station, you know. The point is we like life to occasionally be unpredictable, full of surprises. And we like, of course, to feel alive. And we know intuitively that being alive without feeling alive is like eating food that has no taste to it. You know? So, as for how we go about losing our sense of vitality over time, which often happens to people, and continually choosing security and safety, first and foremost, let me share this. Are you guys familiar with a poet by the name of Robert Bly? Does that ring a bell, Robert Bly? He was big in what's called the mythopoetic men's movement. And he's an awesome poet in his own right. He wrote a book years ago called A Little Book on the Human Shadow. Okay, little tiny book. You can read it in one afternoon. Better actually at night to read this book. But he says, he has the most elegant description in there I've ever run across for how people lose their sense of authenticity and expressiveness and passion in life. And it's a very simple explanation, and this is how it goes. He says when we're 1 or 2 years old, each one of us has a 360-degree personality, all right? Energy, exuberance, enthusiasm radiating out in every direction until our parents start sending us to our rooms for radiating certain parts of it. Okay? I spent the majority of my childhood on Ritalin for doing some of this, me and my twin brother. All right? So there was a woman that I consulted with last year here in Asheville. She said that when she was growing up, her parents sent her to her room for any displays of negative emotions. Bless you. Tears, frustration, anger, certainly. So in other words, what they're doing is they're not only punishing her, they're banishing her. You know, it's what some of the religious communities to this day call disfellowshipping. You know, you banish them. And so here she is. She's 40 years old. She, after a lifetime of repressing half her emotional repertoire, frankly, she is now feeling blocked from being her full, powerful self. And the one I think she's going to need in order to become the healer that she intuits herself to be. Build a vocation around that. Build a life around that. All right? And I think she very rightly describes her mission in life at 40 years old as soul retrieval, which is a fascinating idea, a fascinating phrase. Soul retrieval. All right? So, here's another. What Bly says is that each one of us has an invisible bag that we drag behind us through life. And whatever parts of us our parents did not like get sliced off the pie and stuffed in the bag. Okay? Then he says we get into school in the spirit of fitting in and bringing home report cards that say gets along well with others, you know. we slice even more of ourselves off the pie and put it in the bag, right? You know Carl Sagan, right? He once wrote a story about the difference between going into a kindergarten class and a high school class to talk about science, all right? And you can probably see where this is going to end up. Kindergartners, open for business. You know, runway kept clear at all times for incoming adventure, you know? And just avidly curious, endlessly enthusiastic. I read in Newsweek magazine that children ask their parents an average of 100 questions a day, which would try the patience of even the most committed parents, I think, you know, and teachers. He said the high schoolers, jaded. What in that happens in that 10 years? You know, the sense of wonder, which I think of as one of the active ingredients in a passionate life. Do not lose your sense of wonder, all right? Relegate it to kid stuff by the time you're in high school. You know, and of course you're terrified of asking dumb questions, all right? Then we get into the working world, all right? And in service of continuing to win friends and influence people, you slice even more of yourself off, stuff it in the bag, okay? These are the parts of you that organizational life would probably prefer you leave out in the parking lot when you punch in. You know, your emotional life, your personal life, your spiritual life. When I used to take the callings material into the corporate world, I was literally told on a few occasions, don't use that word. Don't say the word callings here. It's brined in religious overtones, you're just going to turn everybody off. So it's interesting. What happens, Bly says, is that out of the nice round globe of life force that every one of us started this game out with, he said the average 20-year-old ends up with a slice. So he says, we spend the first 20 years of our lives deciding what's going to go in the bag, and the rest of our lives trying to get them out again. And this is not so easy. I was reminded how not easy this is. A couple of years back, I went out to visit my twin brother Ross. He lives in Santa Cruz, California. And we're hiking around in the Santa Cruz Mountains, near where he lives. And we're having a debate about how susceptible we are to cultural conditioning. I think it started with him making some declaration about being immune to advertising. So that got me going. And to make a point to him about how susceptible we actually are to cultural conditioning, I dared him to hold hands with me. Until we reached a bend in the forest path, maybe 100 feet up, okay? So he reaches out his hand, accompanied by a look that roughly translates to, I call your bluff, okay? So there was nobody around. We're in the middle of the forest. There was clearly nobody around, but the next 10 seconds of our lives provoked an outbreak of reflexes that would have put Pavlov's dogs to shame. I'm not kidding. Embarrassment, awkwardness, self-consciousness, paranoia, even a little revulsion, just pure conditioning. Pure conditioning. All we were doing was holding hands, just really barely pushing a toe across the line, especially in a place like Santa Cruz, California, you know? I mean, my God, it makes Asheville look conservative, you know? And all the alarm bells went off. All the alarm bells went off. And I wouldn't be a proper twin either if I didn't report to you that he broke first. I'm sorry, it's just, he would have said the same thing. It's what twins do. So here's just a few things I want to share about what I've learned in doing research for the Vital Signs book especially, on how you get it back, how you begin to reclaim, to do some soul retrieval, okay? Number one, for starters, passion can be cultivated, all right? This is not one from the either you got it or you don't department. Passion can be cultivated, all right? Turned on as well as turned off. And I think that it happens most readily at the level of the gesture, the moment, the decision, not the 5-year plan, right? Not the extreme makeover. And I'll give you an example. I'm sitting around with some friends here in Asheville a couple of years ago, one evening, and one of them says, you know what the problem is? We're not outrageous enough. So I asked him, what would you do if you were going to be more outrageous? And he thought for a moment, and then he reached up and he swept his hair from middle parted and slicked back to side parted with a cowlick dangling over his forehead, right? I mean, just like instantly transforming him from Richard to Ricardo, And he said, I would come into work like this. Okay? So this is the level at which I'm encouraging people to address these things, is looking for the subtlest impulses to express yourself. All right? The subtlest impulses to speak your mind, speak your heart, say what's real for you, be who you really are. To look for those little switch points, little choice points in the course of any given day that take you either toward or away from your sense of aliveness. All right? Number 2, I think passion is ultimately in the risk. Passion is in the risk, in the willingness to step from the sidelines onto the playing fields. And I think, again, it starts with the smallest kinds of gestures, Anybody ever see a movie called We Bought a Zoo? Does it ring a bell? We Bought a Zoo. This is apparently a true story about a family that bought a zoo. And in the movie version, the protagonist, who's played by Matt Damon, says to another character at one point, all you need is 20 seconds of insane courage, and I promise you something great will come of it. I just think that's fascinating, So, in other words, the horse and cart equation is not necessarily that you identify your passions and then start taking risks on their behalf, but that sometimes by taking risks, by making decisions, by putting yourself on the line, you begin to clarify what your passions are and start bringing them to life. Sometimes it works that way. I consulted with a guy last year who said that he was convinced he needed, as he put it, absolute clarity about some particular passion before he could start acting on it. Absolute clarity. Yeah. And I suggested that maybe the clarity he seemed intent on finding, he was only going to find by taking action. You know what I'm saying? It's like, which is the more heroic ultimately? Waiting until you have absolute clarity before setting out on your hero's journey, or setting out in the absence of absolute clarity? Which is the more heroic, really? So, and of course, risk is absolutely relative. You know what I'm saying? This is not a comparison game. Risk is whatever scares you. Whatever's capable of lighting your fires, bringing some excitement into your life, right? And it isn't necessarily the big scary stuff, like jumping out of airplanes. I met a woman recently who traveled around the world solo for a year. It's not necessarily that stuff. Maybe it's the stuff much closer to home, all right? Taking your jokes to open mic night. Being the first to make up after a quarrel, all right? When somebody asks you how you are, tell them how you really are. Make love with your eyes open or the lights on. Say yes to something you've been saying no to, or say no to something you've been putting up with for too long, or bundle some novelty into your days. All right? Because I think novelty is really kind of a corrective for habit and routine and kind of everyday trances. All right? So get up on the other side of the bed than the one you always get up on. See what happens. Sit at a different side of the breakfast table for breakfast than the one you always sit at. Because a quarter turn, one direction or the other, and the whole view changes. drive to work a slightly different route than the one you always take. Okay? I came through a roundabout here on the way, on whatever that Fern Cliff Road is, and you go around and you make a left. Well, instead of doing that, how about going around the roundabout twice? There was a roundabout near my house when I lived in Cincinnati, Ohio, and really late at night when nobody was out there. When I locked my steering wheel, let's see, it would have been to the right. My turning radius was exactly corresponded to the size of the circle. And I could just lock it and lean my head out the window and watch the stars wheel by for like a half hour. Don't tell the news of the weird people. But little things like that, or order something different than your usual at the restaurant. Rearrange one piece of furniture in your house. Or how about this? Give yourself over for 1 hour to your writing, your painting, your piano playing, your business planning, your, fill in the blank. 1 hour. Sometimes that's the riskiest thing you can do. So Abraham Maslow, he gave us the hierarchy of needs, all right? Food, clothing, and shelter at the bottom, belonging and community in the middle, self-actualization at the top. So he's the guy who defined the term self-actualization. He said that self-actualizing types are those who make the growth choice over the fear choice a dozen times a day. Now that's a bar set pretty high. A dozen times a day. Wow. I mean, you've heard of mentors. This is more like a tour mentor kind of thing. All right, 2 more. Passion is not just exuberance, I think. It's not just exuberance. It's also endurance. I mean, sometimes shoulder to the wheel, stamina, patience on the order of years. Okay? I think it often requires this. We tend to think, you know who Malcolm Gladwell is? Ring a bell? Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book called Tipping Point. All right? He said that mastery in any field of endeavor requires a minimum of 10,000 hours of dedicated practice. All right? This idea got a lot of press. So here's the math on that, by the way. 90 minutes a day for 20 years. That's his estimation of what constitutes mastery. 90 minutes a day for 20 years, or some variation of that. How many of you guys, for instance, have ever been in a play or a band? All right, a play or a band? Okay, so out of 100%, what percentage of your time was typically spent rehearsing compared to performing? Ballpark. Much more. 80-20? What's your sense? Close to that? 90-10? But I think it's largely passion that explains people's willingness to abide by that equation. Put in thousands of hours of practicing the same lines or the same lyrics for the chance to perform it, publicly, a tenth of the time or so. The word passion, by the way, comes from a word meaning to suffer. All right? So one of the questions that it begs is, what are you willing to suffer for? Suffering, by the way, just means to bear. What are you willing to bear with to bring your passions to fruition, up to and including the point of mastery? What are you willing to bear with? All right? Unfortunately, of course, we tend to think of passion as kind of an inherently unstable element. It's like you go to the periodic chart and you find passion, and it says, prone to degrading quickly when exposed to familiarity or commitment. We think of it sort of like a booster rocket in the space program. It launches us into outer space, whether it's infatuations or creative inspirations or whatever, but then once the orbit is reached, it falls away. All right? I don't really think that's necessarily the way it goes. Real passion, I think, has real staying power. I think of one of my heroes, Scheherazade. All right? She's the queen whose stories make up all the Arabian Nights. all right? And it took her 1,001 nights. That's 3 years to turn the Sultan around. That's staying power. That's a passion for storytelling too, you know? And I have an acquaintance in Seattle who once told me that he was once arrested at an anti-war sit-in and given a suspended sentence with 15 hours of community service. And the judge said to him, you can do any kind of service you want. So when they let him out, he went right back to the sit-in. And he said to me, when he told me about this, he said, I was doing community service when they arrested me. You know, so the continual return. All right, one more. I think that if we lack passion in our own lives, or for our own lives, I think our other relationships are going to be kind of denied that energy. You know, our partnerships, our friendships, our kids, our classrooms, and corporations, communities, congregations are going to be denied that energy, right? It begins here, starting with the one-on-one. You know, in other words, one person following their passion can have a profound effect on the unfolding of other people's passion. And especially if you're in any position of leadership or stewardship. All right? Maybe even especially in regards to children and young adults. All right? So, but whether you are a parent, teacher, mentor, minister, manager, coach, performer, politician, CEO, I think this much is certain. Your passion is critical to their engagement. Doesn't that sound familiar? Anybody in a position of leadership or stewardship? Your passion is critical to their engagement. I think that this certainly explains why when I headed off to college, my dad's advice to me was, don't take courses, take professors. Isn't that interesting? So, the mechanics of inspiration being what they are, this works as surely at the collective level as it does at the personal and interpersonal, all right? The Gallup company, you know, the Gallup polls, right? They did a worldwide survey in 2012, 142 countries, and they found that on average, 87% of workers in the world are either not engaged or actively disengaged. 13% were engaged. And they calculated, I don't know how they do these things, but that this comes out to a $500 billion a year in lost productivity just in our country. Okay, that's $500 billion a year in lost productivity, all right? And so what this means, all right, to use a metaphor, is what this study means is that if you're part of a rowing team out on a river, what it means is that one of those team members is rowing his or her heart out, 5 of them are just taking in the scenery, and 2 of them are actively trying to sink the boat, you know? You know, so not checked out, okay? The idea of being checked out, this is what not engaged means, all right? That's essentially what that means. You're checked out. Actively disengaged, however, means that you are busy acting out your unhappiness and your dispiritedness and spreading the virus around among your colleagues and your friends and your, your cohorts, your students, you know? And it was interesting to me that there was no category at all in the Gallup poll for actively engaged, i.e. passionate. I mean, what is that? There's not enough people in that category to make it statistically significant? And that would be significant in itself, of course. You know? So, if dispassion is contagious, so is passion. It's just that we have to catch it first before we can spread it. All right? So let me wind up with this beautiful little story that really captures the power of passion and inspiration, inspiring by example. This comes from the Colombian novelist Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Okay? He tells the story of a man who's trying to solve the world's problems. His little boy comes running into the study and asks him if he can help. And The man is touched by his son's concern, but he's impatient to get on with it. So he takes a map of the world and he rips it into little tiny pieces and he gives it to the boy and says, here, you can help by piecing the world back together. All right? The boy has no conception, of course, of what the world looks like, but he takes the scraps of paper off to his room. 2 days later, he comes running back in and he says, Father, I've put the world back together. And all the little shreds of paper are now very meticulously taped back together. And the father is stunned. He says, how did you do that? And the boy says, well, I turned the paper over. On the back was a picture of a person. I put the person back together, and then I turned it over, and the world was back together. Isn't that a beautiful story? That just so beautifully captures it. So in closing, I just want to say that the workshop this afternoon, 1 to 4, is just a very hands-on opportunity to explore sort of the state of your own vitality at the moment, all right? And where passion appears and where it disappears in your life, all right? So I hope you'll come. And thank you so much, Darlene, for inviting me back. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Thank you.